coming into a season where many, many prodigals are coming home. People that have been hurt, people that have been enticed by the temporary pleasures of sin, and lots of other reasons. But I stepped back into the church, and I found a good church. It was a good Bible-believing, preaching, teaching church, and I jumped back in, and there was a pretty vibrant group of young adults there that had come into something that I knew nothing about, because in my time of hiatus, something called the Jesus movement and the beginnings of the charismatic movement were happening. So there was this movement among my generation of people coming to Jesus. So, people were starting to get saved by the hundreds in campuses, universities, high schools. And they were doing these outdoor concerts, but they were Christian. Before I ran away from God and then came back, I had never heard drums or guitars in church. That was sinful. All we had were pianos and organs. And that was painful. But this music was starting. People had gotten saved out of rock bands, and they started bringing their guitars and their bass guitars and their drums and playing and jamming for Jesus. And I found myself thinking, is this okay? And I like it, but is this okay? Can you really do that and God be okay with it? But there was something on it, So I knew it was I just thought, this has to be okay. And then hundreds and then thousands of young people started getting saved, and God had an answer for the rebellion of the late 60s and early 70s, because of the disillusionment of a generation over Vietnam, Watergate, and just parents that had failed them, and just anti-establishment. Some of you remember this, others of you are too young to remember it, but there was a movement in America that was very, very, very wild, even violent. College campuses were burned, takeover buildings, riots filled the streets. On another side, the civil rights movement was beginning, and African Americans were starting to stand up and say, hey, we want to be treated better. And they were protesting, and that was sometimes would turn to violence. And, it was just, and the Vietnam War was going on and had just ended, but in the course of the build-up to it, this generation became filled with anger and resentment and confusion and disillusionment. So they turned to the drugs of the 60s, and the drug culture was born, and the sexual revolution was born, and millions of young people were infected with this. And we had what was called the generation gap. And many Americans just found themselves thinking, it's over. We'll never recover from this. And a lot of Christians just thought it's the end. Jesus is going to return soon. It's bad. But God had an answer. He met that disillusionment with this spiritual awakening. And thousands of kids started coming to the Lord, and some of them, they were communes, because people would just get so fed up with society, these young people started communes. And they just go live out in groups of people, 30, 40, 50, get tents and just live out there and smoke dope and have sex. And they started getting saved in their communes. Kids, this one, I went to Christ for Nations, and in the late 70s, and there were kids coming to Christ for the Nations from communes, coming in barefooted and with their beads and their hair hanging down and their tie-dyed shirts, and all these 50, 60-year-old teachers and professors are kind of going, we're supposed to get them saved before they get here. These kids find Jesus and they hear about this Bible school where they can come and get to know God and go do something. Well, they started sitting there, kids would sit around the campfire smoking joints. What do you think about this Jesus, man? What do you think about this Jesus movement? It was just strange. It was crazy. There was this holy curiosity. There was this interest born of the Spirit of God. I've been here, I'm serious. In passing, I've been here about this Jesus, man. What do you think? I don't know, man. What do you think? This movement was born. And tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands started getting saved. And at first, nobody knew what to do with it because they didn't go get a suit and show up on Sunday morning. They just showed up kind of the way the band looked tonight. Except these guys were clean and some of the Jesus people weren't. Remember what Chuck Smith tells a story out in California. About 300 of these kids showed up at his place one Sunday morning. And they came in, they were barefoot and nasty, dirty, came from a commune, hadn't bathed in a while, and they had their stringy hair and their dirty feet, and they kind of smelly, and most of them smelled like dope probably. And the elders met him after the service and said, "You got to do something about these kids. They're going to ruin the new carpet." And he said, "I'll take care of it, don't worry about it." And when they came back next Sunday, he ripped up all the carpet. And hundreds, probably thousands of kids came through his church. And that's where a lot of the contemporary Christian music was born, out of his congregation, because he had a heart to receive and an eye to see, an ear to hear that this is so different, but it's God. And that was happening in tandem with the charismatic movement. And then the older folks started getting saved. Business people and others, just there was this outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And then people started getting filled with the Holy Spirit and receiving the prayer language, and by the hundreds of thousands, literally. And it was happening in every denomination. And Baptists are getting it, Nazarenes are getting it, Catholics are getting it. So I remember when I saw my first nun in her habit, dancing before the Lord and worshiping and singing in tongues. And the first time I saw it, I'm having a conference, because it was the first week I got to Christ for the Nations. And see, in the church I was raised in, you couldn't use anything but a King James Bible. And the great harlot in the book of Revelation in the King James Bible was the great whore. And in my church, the Catholic Church was the great whore. And I told the Lord very quickly, that ain't right. She can't do that. She can still be in her habit with her rosary dangling and her, whatever you call it, dancing around. I heard a priest, he still had one of those funky collars. He still called himself a Catholic, teaching, praying for the sick, lead people to Jesus, fill the Spirit. I said, I don't know what to do with this. It started happening by the